Welcome, everyone. A lot of familiar faces in the audience, so that's great to see you. Thank you for coming and making such a large amount of your day today. I was elected to the City Council. My name is Greg Gilbert, for those who don't know me. I was elected 20 years ago this campaign season. And, you know, it's kind of funny. There are things that are the same and things that change. And when I was on City Council, the main communication method was letters and telephone calls. Well, that's changed, but you know, one thing that hasn't changed in Duluth are the commitment of the people that run for office, how they're all anxious to get the best city they can have. And one thing that hasn't changed is the commitment of the people of the city of Duluth. The passion they hold for their politics and ability to keep their elected officials accountable and do what they think is best for the city. So in that spirit, we're going to talk about politics all afternoon. I love this stuff. So if I get too long-winded and wrong, you tell Charlotte to grab me and hold me off, because this is I can't imagine a more fun way to spend the afternoon. A few ground rules. We've got 4 groups that are working, that spent a lot of time working with this: Duluth for Clean Water, Feminist Action Collective, our Revolution-Duluth, and Twin Ports DSA. And a special thanks for Charlotte for being Charlotte Gardner for being the person that's doing the legwork to set this event up. And JT Haynes. Where's JT? JT and Jen Matthew. Few ground rules. We've got campaign tabling and staff will be out there. Not so much in here. This will be more, we're looking for fairness and encouragement for all the candidates, because it's a big deal to put yourself out there in exposure. And so we want to be supportive as everyone as we can. So we might as well get started. No applause, please, until the end. You can sit on your hands or go excited. But our first candidate is Joel Sipress. He's running for re-election in the 2nd District. And Joel's been a good friend of mine for over 20 years. We've done political work together here in Duluth, and I think a good person to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. Now, we have 4 speakers, or 4 facilitators. It's not a question and answer from the audience, but if you would like to have questions, deliver them to the facilitators, and I'll introduce them now. And that's certainly free throughout the entire session. I think there are probably cards to write on, or you can text them, and we're going to do it kind of in that fashion for a more orderly questioning. Charlotte, we're
not texting, we're writing them on cards. We're trying to discourage use of cell phones.
Oh, all right. You got it. Our facilitators are Mike Guido from the DSA. Mike? Okay, right, Mike. And Charlotte Gardner. So they're the people for DSA if you want to contact. JT Haynes and Libby Bent are the Clean Water facilitators. Jen Mackey and Ashley Northerly are the Feminist Action people, and then Mike Mayo from New Revolution. So our Revolution. So feel free to contact them and let them go. And the order, we're going to start out alphabetical order, asking the questions, and then every session we're going to move along in the alphabet, give everybody a fair chance and rotate as best we can. Thank you for your patience, Joel. Let's go, Mike.
I get 2 intro.
Oh, intro session?
2-minute intro.
I just know everything about you already. I assume everybody else did, Joe.
Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks for being the MC for this. And by the way, Greg Gilbert is my city councilor, and he was my city councilor for 12 years and was a great city councilor, and really honored to hold the seat that Greg used to hold. So thanks for all your service to the city. I'm really thrilled to be here, really thrilled about this event. I want to thank the organizers of the 4 groups, and I think it's interesting to note that the 4 groups that are sponsoring this, Our Revolution, Twin Ports DSA, Feminist Action Collective, and Our Revolution, I said all 4 of them, Duluth for Clean Water, none of them existed a year ago, which is amazing. I think we're living through some really difficult and uncertain times in our country, but if there's a silver lining, the silver lining is I think that a lot of us have realized that in order for the changes we want to see in our country, in our community, in our world, we can't wait around for our political leaders to do it for us. And I think that's reflected in the energy we're seeing in this community, in these new organizations, in this event. So I'm really excited. In fact, I spent over 20 years in this community working, doing exactly the kind of work these four groups are doing. And I am and will always remain a movement person at heart. And what these groups are doing is exactly what we need to see in our community and all over the country if we're going to build a better future for all of us. 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to go on the city council, and as a city councilor, I view my most important role as making sure that people who would not otherwise be heard have a voice and are represented when decisions that affect their lives are made. And in that sense, I am still a movement person at heart, although when you're in office, you have to weigh certain kinds of factors that you don't always think about when you're doing the movement work. But we can't do the work we do without the movement people doing the work that you all are doing. So thank you, and let's get right to the questions.
Thank you, Joel. Mike.
Lots of hands, please.
Thank you, Joel, for coming today, and thank you, Greg, for moderating the whole event. And thank you all for coming here today. And my name is Mike Quitu, and I'm going to ask questions of Joel Sipress, Council President. Joel, this question is from Comrade Jerry Whitty. You stated in your answers to the written questions that you have reservations about pursuing a local $15 an hour minimum wage for the city of Duluth. Are there other increases besides the $15 level that you would consider, or conditions that might cause you to reconsider the $15 level?
So just a thought on this. The reason I have reservations about the local $15 minimum wage is pretty simple. Like it or not, for better or for worse, we live in a capitalist system, which means communities like Duluth are dependent on the decisions that those who own and control capital make about where to put their investment and where to employ people. Which means that we do need to be thoughtful about choosing our battles. We need to hold those who employ people in our community accountable. We need to set standards, but we need to choose our battles carefully. And before we pursue something like a $15 minimum wage, we need to make sure that we are confident that we can do that without having a negative effect on job opportunities in Duluth. So there are conditions under which I would embrace that. As an example, I gave the exact same answer last time I ran on would I support an earned sick and safe time ordinance. And the answer I gave was I would need to look and research its impact on local job opportunities. I did that research. In fact, I was the only DFL candidate when I ran who didn't pledge to support an earned sick and safe time ordinance, because I said I had to look at the potential impact on our labor market and our job opportunities first. I did the research, and based on the effect on other communities, it was clear to me we could do an earned sick and safe time ordinance. And while other candidates who pledged to support it started waffling once they were in office, I did the opposite. I did my research, determined we can do it, and I've gone to the wall for that issue. If on investigating this and really looking at the economics of it, we were to determine that this is something that we as a relatively fragile economy can actually pursue, I would go to the wall for it.
Thank you. JT or Libby?
Hi, my name is JT Haynes with Duluth for Clean Water. Libby Bent and I will be rotating screenings throughout the course of the afternoon. Councilor Sipress, first of all, thank you for voting yes on the Duluth City Council resolution calling for an evidentiary hearing on Polymet. At yesterday's climate march, you discussed some of the pressures elected officials face, including at the city council level. What is your approach to the industry lobby, particularly with regard to issues like Polymet?
Well, thanks for the question, and you're welcome for the vote. It was the right vote, which is why I did it. And again, it's not something I did lightly. I spent about 2 years researching the Polymet issue after I got on the council before I took that decision to co-author that resolution. My approach as a city councilor is to talk to anybody. I actually took a little junket up to the Polymet site during my first year on the council to hear the company's pitch. I had conversations with representatives and lobbyists from Polymet. I've met with lobbyists from the plastics industry on the proposed plastic bag ban. I've spent a morning with people who work in the local energy industry. So I think it's important to have lines of communication open with all the interests in our community, but in the end, I represent the people of the 2nd District. And it's important to be in conversation with industry lobbyists. It's important to have lines of communication. It's important to hear their perspectives. My trip to Polymet was actually really useful because I walked away from Polymet and that trip up there, listening to the industry's perspective, with a clear understanding of what the issue actually was. Before I took that trip, I heard all kinds of stuff from both sides. And when I came back from the Polymet site, I thought to myself, okay, I get what this is really all about. The big questions are, how much is going to leak? What's going to be the impact if it leaks? What are the chances of a catastrophic failure of the tailings basin, and what would that mean? And if I hadn't listened to the industry's perspective, it would have been harder for me to clarify those questions. I then did what any good elected official does. I went out and sought people who didn't have a vested interest in the project, who had scientific knowledge and technical knowledge, and asked them, essentially off the record, because people don't want to go on the record, what they thought about this. And it was those conversations that led me to my position on the issue.
Thank you. Jen or Ashley?
I'm Ashley Northam from the Feminist Action Collective. How would you prioritize city investments in housing, retail, parks and trails in order to achieve equality for people of color, LGBTQ, and the poor?
Could you repeat the three areas that were listed, please?
How would you prioritize city investments in housing, retail, parks and trails?
The easiest one is retail. With very few exceptions, retail should be financed through private investment. With very, very few exceptions, the city shouldn't be subsidizing private retail businesses for a host of reasons. The one exception to that is we do have underserved communities, underserved neighborhoods, like Lincoln Park. If it takes some city support and investment to get a grocery store in an underserved neighborhood like Lincoln Park, which is a food desert, that makes sense. But generally speaking, city funds shouldn't be subsidizing the retail industry. On the other hand, housing is absolutely a place where the city does and needs to continue putting resources. It's simply a fact that the private market has never in this country been able to produce affordable housing for working people. And the main reason for that is the cost of building housing is such that it's very difficult to build enough housing that working people can afford. And it's always been subsidized through things like the mortgage interest deduction or through Section 8. And we absolutely need to be continuing to support and put public resources, and our priority has to be affordable, decent rental housing. That's where the crisis in our city is. It's almost impossible to find a decent place to rent in that sort of $500 to $1,000 range. And I know there are probably people in this room who have experienced that. That has got to be our priority for the resources we put into housing. And parks, money is so tight in the city, and it breaks my heart that we can't do more than we do. We have a designated parks fund that the city, the voters of the city approved, and that's where we get most of our parks funding from. And I'm glad that we have that, but it would be tough to put more money into parks right now than we already do.
Thank you. Mike Mayo from Our Revolution.
All right, I'm Mike. So from Our Revolution, we have, how do you define the term inclusive, and how will you strive to be inclusive throughout all steps of the process as a city councilor?
It's a good question. I guess my definition of inclusive means that everybody, regardless of who they are, what they do for a living, their race, their ethnicity, their gender identity, their sex, their income, their background, everybody is of equal value, which means that everybody needs to have a seat at the table. And that's my definition of inclusive, is that we need to make sure that no matter who you are, you have a voice. And I work very hard to do that as a counselor. Some people have a voice very easily. I mean, if you have connections, if you have money, if you live in a neighborhood where a lot of people vote, you automatically get a voice. And so I've tried to take steps to make sure that those who would be less likely to have a voice have representation. So for example, that's why when I got on the council, I almost immediately made a priority to get to know and work with people on the Indigenous Commission. That's why I've taken the opportunity to visit with the NAACP at their meetings, even on specific issues like making sure we have more diverse representation in our city boards and commissions. That's why before I was a city councilor, when I was involved in supporting candidates and campaigns, when we were doing candidate development, I always made sure we were prioritizing development of candidates who are less likely to put themselves forward. So when I was in the Green Party for a number of years, when we do candidate development, we've always made a priority that we would first try to develop and recruit female candidates, and we wouldn't go out recruiting and developing male candidates unless and until we couldn't identify female candidates for particular positions. That's a commitment we had as an organization. So you have to self-consciously go out and reach out and bring in groups that don't already have a voice, and that's something that I've always tried to do.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Joel. This question is from Democratic Socialists again. The median income for white households in the city of Duluth was around $53,000 in 2015. In stark contrast, the median income for African Americans was around $13,000 and under $20,000 for Native Americans. What can the city of Duluth do to address this huge income disparity?
Okay, that's one of our greatest challenges. But the first thing I want to say, and this is very important to say, is that in order to address the racial and ethnic disparities in our community, we can't separate them from the huge class disparities we have in our community, because the two are interlinked. And so I would add to that question, what can we do to make sure we create more economic opportunity for those who have been marginalized on the basis of race or ethnicity? How can we also make sure we create better economic opportunities for everyone who is marginalized in our community? But specifically on the issue of what can we do, one thing we're already doing and that the mayor is doing, for example, is we've been doing an audit at the city of our job qualifications for city jobs. Do we have artificial barriers in our job descriptions and in our application requirements that tend to sort of keep people out for no good reason? One obvious one is driver's licenses. There are a lot of people in our community, low-income people who don't have driver's licenses, people of color who don't have driver's licenses, and yet we have job requirements for jobs with the city where it requires a driver's license where you really don't need one to do the job. That's an example of where we as a city can lower barriers that prevent marginalized people from getting equal employment opportunities. We also need to be, that's something the city can do directly, but we need to have an effort in our community to encourage private employers to be doing the same thing. That's just one example where we have, artificial barriers to job opportunities. And another good example is we've got the building trades who need apprentices. They've got a shortage of apprentices. We have people who are looking for opportunities within communities of color who haven't had those opportunities before. We need to address and identify what are the barriers to preventing people who've not historically been in the trades from getting into the trades and work on that. And that's something that I've been involved in conversations around, and I'm hoping that as we move forward, we can actually get that done. There's been a lot of talk around that issue for years. We need to actually act on it.
Thank you, Joel. JT.
Minnesota's environmental laws are often cited as protection from the dangers of copper sulfide mining. However, as we speak, proposals are in place to gut water quality standards and regulatory agencies, both nationally and here in Minnesota. For just one example, there's a move right now by the majority party to reduce or eliminate the nearly 50-year-old Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, which manages water resources. Our question is, how do you reconcile the claims about environmental laws with the simultaneous threats to environmental laws?
Well, you only have to reconcile them if you actually believe the first claim. And the reason I'd be skeptical of the first claim is, yes, Minnesota has very strong environmental laws, but those didn't happen by accident. Those happened because people fought to get strong environmental laws. And we know that if people do not struggle to maintain strong environmental laws, there's constant pressure to relax them. Even without legislation, there's something that's known as regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is what happens when people in an industry actually begin to have undue influence over the regulatory system. One of the reasons that I introduced and voted for the resolution calling for the evidentiary hearing is that the Minnesota DNR has a conflict of interest. The Minnesota DNR is responsible both for promoting mining and for regulating mining. And that creates an inherent conflict of interest between the two roles of the DNR. Some people have suggested we should separate those roles and have one agency be the development agency and another agency be the regulatory agency. I think that's a good idea. But in the meantime, we have to be eternally vigilant to make sure that the industries that are regulated by our regulatory agencies don't actually capture and influence our regulatory agencies. And so, so to me, that there's really nothing to reconcile. It's just a general rule of thought that you always have to be vigilant to make sure you maintain the protections we have and make sure the people who are charged with enforcing those regulations are not being unduly influenced by the people that regulate it.
Thank you, Jen or Ashley.
How would you address sexism and disproportionate cyberbullying facing female leaders who are holding local office?
Wow. The first thing I would want to know is more about incidents of that. Because as a local elected official, the most important thing I can do is to provide both private support and public support, and to call out bullying of whatever kind based on identity. So I guess, that's my immediate reaction, is that the first thing I would want to do is to invite those who are aware of this to approach me, and would probably initially want to be an off-the-record, confidential conversations. I know these are very sensitive matters. But it was brought to my attention, the first thing I would say is, what can I do as a public figure? As a city councilor, I have little direct authority to prevent that. But as a public figure, all public figures, all elected leaders can influence the climate in our community. And so the first thing I would do is to ask, to learn more about what's going on, and then to ask, what can I do as an ally to provide both private and public support?
Okay, now it's 12:55, and our plan is to adjourn each session. We're going to have each speaker come in every half hour and have a 5-minute break in between the sessions. But my watch might be a little off, so Mike, if you have a quick question and Joel a quick answer, we'll call it a day.
It's our host.
We'll try and make this a quick question. What do you see as the 1 to 3 most pressing issues facing Duluth today?
I can answer that pretty clearly, and I divide the two categories. In terms of the services that the city provides to the public, the greatest challenge we have is how to actually maintain and invest in our city infrastructure at a time when the state and federal governments are walking away from their responsibilities to cities and to our nation's infrastructure. We have a street system that is failing. What many people aren't aware of is we have a water system that's also failing. And the challenge is that the easiest ways for the city to get money is property taxes, which are regressive, and raising the utility fees, which is regressive. We've been hoping to get more support from the state and federal government, but right now we can't count on that. So we've got some very, very hard decisions we're going to have to make as a city about how we actually make sure that our city doesn't literally fall apart at a time when the state and federal government have essentially walked away from their responsibilities. The second thing I would add is the economic inequities in our city. We have huge economic inequities in our city. Nearly 40% of the households in Duluth live on less than $30,000 a year. And working at UW Superior, where I work with a lot of first generation and low income students, I see every day the impact that these economic inequities are having on people's lives as they struggle just to kind of hold themselves together. In the case of my students, figure out some way to actually be a student. So I would say that the infrastructure challenges and the huge economic inequities we have in our city, to me, are the two greatest challenges we have.
Right. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone. We'll meet at convene.
Thank you.